Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Man.
Amen.
So the passage that we are looking at Ha'azinu, and it is in poetry. It's a poetry section in poetry. It's actually written in a different style that is not only is the language much more difficult and much more poetic and much more literary than most of the Torah, but also if you look at it, we know, for example, that the Song of the Red Sea is written in the Sefer Torah itself in a sort of a wave pattern, and Ha'azinu is written in two columns, and you can always see Ha'azinu as we're getting close to the end of the book of Deuteronomy. But I'm saying all this as an attempted excuse to you for the fact that the language is hard and difficult, and I struggle with it, and hopefully I'll still be able to, share with you, and that you'll find this interesting and worthwhile. So let's take a look at it. Let me find it. 1 second, I'm going to have to do this differently. One moment. While I find the place. Right, now we can do it. And you should be able to see it now. So we, of course, had started this a year ago or 2 years ago, and we essentially it is a poem that Moses is told to share with the Jewish people by way of explaining the dynamics of their relationship with God, and as a warning to them in a hopes that they will read this poem and they'll understand why things are happening the way they are, and they'll be able to prevent some serious errors in their choices in the future, because here they are coming to enter the land of Canaan, to occupy it, to thrive there. And of course, already we know that destruction is going to follow, that exile is going to follow. This is this huge dynamic of Jewish history that takes place, and the tragedy of centuries of living in exile and being persecuted, etc. And so this poem is being offered in the hopes of preventing that from happening. And what's happened is we're describing now how God has allowed the Jewish people to thrive in the land of Israel, and how and describing in various ways the loveliness of their lives and their wealth and their prosperity and things like that. And of course, in a verse or two, we will see the lack of appreciation that the Israelites or the Jewish people have for all this prosperity. So,
And in addition, there's a lot of tragedy in occupying people's lands and prosperity for us, because that, causes jealousy and rivalry
yes.
or contributes, I'll say, rather than causes to jealousy and rivalry and hardships and
Right.
enemies.
Right. So I would say that applies certainly nowadays, right? I think that we have to look at this in a different kind of way, but at least from, looking this as literature, and saying the choices, at least as presented in the literature, are relatively clear and easy. And the dynamic basically is that the Canaanites were perverse. They were doing disgusting things, and they are being punished by God through the Israelites, who are now occupying that territory. I mean, I'm giving a very brief summary as to why the Canaanites no longer were entitled to that territory, but the justice of it, the justice of it was the fact that the Israelites would be held up to the same standards, and if they behaved like the Canaanites, they get the same treatment. So, but to suggest that that applies nowadays, or that the people who were occupying the land of Israel prior to the establishment of the statehood, can be compared to the Canaanites, I think that would be an abomination.
But that's
Yeah.
not what I'm saying. And I'm not, you
Okay.
say it's different modern times and those times, But then again, the book was written by the victor, the people who ended up with the land and ended up prospering. And I understand what you're saying, that that's not the point of the book. The point of the book is to correct the Israelites and to
Hmm.
have them have a relationship with God and understand, you know, a godly life versus but it's all land based, and it's all occupation based, and it's all, us versus them based, and it's, you can't separate that. And there is a um perspective that's outside the perspective that is the, Israelitish perspective presented in the Torah, that these Canaanites or Edomites or theseites or thoseites may have, that's different from ours, and they may be missing the point of the goodness that's in there, and reacting to things like occupation and prosperity in a negative way. And you were talking about the tragedy of not being in the land, and I'm talking about there's also tragedy of being in the land, of having that prosperity.
So I'm not sure I thought I was following you up until the very end. So what is the tragedy of having that land? I'm sorry if I'm
It's
misunderstanding
part
you.
of our being the occupier, the conqueror, the winner, the prosperity. It's a good thing for us, but when something's good for one party, it's not always good for the other party, which is kind of why um, goodness is not always objective, and fairness is not, necessarily a real concept, because you have a perspective and things seem fair and good, but you can go outside of that group and have a different perspective, and it's not an evil perspective necessarily, but it may conflict with the version of what's good and what's fair. So when you have the land and you have prosperity, that can say, well, God is rewarding us and God is good. But there's also, and we're doing good and getting those rewards. And, of course, we want to concentrate a little bit more on what's after having the land, but after we die on the land. But, while we're having that perspective that is based on prosperity in the land and based on living this current life, there always somebody that's outside of that prosperity, and somebody who's not on the land who wants to be. And that, so our perspective is one thing, but what you're saying is, I mean, what I heard you say is that there's tragedy, which you're right, and I'm not arguing that there's not tragedy in being punished and exiled. Obviously, there is. But what I'm saying is there's continued tragedy with having the land and having the prosperity because of the conflicts with
So
the external conflicts.
okay. So again, if I'm understanding you correctly, I think that is the reason, at least I've always felt, that the measure of the greatness of any society is how it takes and cares for the underprivileged. Okay. So there are many, of course, laws within the Torah here about how to take care and how to be concerned about people who are in poverty, etc. And my sense is that, there's a great statement that says, that God expects different things from the wealthy and from the poor. And that from the wealthy, the expectation is that there not be a sense of this is all mine and I'm just going to hold on to it with both my hands and my fists tightly, clenched over my thing, but rather a sense of an ability to be able to share it with people who are not in that position. And I would count that even for people who maybe, were displaced, et cetera, et cetera, whether it's possible to act in a warm-hearted kind of way to try and be sensitive to those things, if in fact that's what you're referring to.
And yes, and those are beautiful ideals, but no matter what group you're in, and no matter what country you're in, and no matter who you are, um, there are leaders and others who support those leaders and who don't have those ideals,
Right,
unfortunately.
exactly. And that is the tragedy. I agree.
Even
I agree.
among,
Right.
the Israelites, whether they're in a situation of prosperity or not.
Well, that's the problem, is that we see that going on in the prophetic material. There's constant, and Amos is a great example of how there are people who are simply living off the fat of the land and are, and simply take advantage of the people who are underprivileged. And this is an abomination, and the
I mean,
prophet
there
argues over that.
I don't want to get too specific into modern Middle Eastern politics, but I will say there are direct things in the Torah that says this is how you should treat people, and that's just not what's happening.
Well, again, when you look at, yes, okay, you're saying on the positive level that
I'm saying the Torah outlines a lot of, ethical demands on how you should
okay,
treat people if you
yes,
own land or if you do this or do that,
right.
and and how you should treat the trees and the environment and what nurtures you, and it's just not always happening. It's just
Absolutely.
that there are
Absolutely.
specific policies sometimes that just go exactly the opposite of what Torah demands. And it's just,
We're
so there's these ideals and
Mhm.
there's reality,
Yeah,
and the reality is a lot more human than these ideals, and it's just,
right.
tragedy. The
It is.
tragedy is
it-
present either way.
well, so that what the whole point about studying Torah is that it's the first step towards bringing heaven down to earth, right? The idea that it is possible for human beings, if they're properly trained and motivated, etc., at least theoretically, to be able to do that and to come closer to that idea. Anyway, yeah, should we go into the text a little bit? At least I'll try and see what I can do. We're describing here their prosperity. So chemat bakar, right? Which and chemah is butter in modern Hebrew. So we're talking about the fat of the milk, right? So here we're talking about the choicest of cattle, right? Okay, or maybe here, yeah, yeah. But I think we'll see how Rashi is going to translate it, okay? And one of the things that Rashi is going to do is give examples of where this actually happened, that it isn't just poetic license here, but these things actually took place. The chalev tzon, and the milk of sheep, im chalev karim, right? And this is the best, right? The choicest lambs. So here we must be talking about like the cream that comes from cows and stuff like that. Here we're talking about that. But here we're talking about chalev. Notice, and Rashi's going to point out the difference between chalev, which is milk, right, and chalev, which has to do with cream and fat, things like that. The Elim and rams, Bnei Bashan of Bashan, rams of Bashan, these were reputed to be, the choicest rams. The Atudim and he goats, Im Chelef Kiliot, right? Well, so again, we're really talking about, sorry, I got to say the whole thing. The Im Chelef Kiliot Chita. Chita is wheat, right? And Chelef Kiliot Chita. I imagine that the Kiliot would be like the grains, the kernels of wheat, and this is like the cream of the kernels of wheat. The dam anav, literally it means the blood of grapes. Tishteh chamer, you shall drink wine. So you can see, even in attempting to try to translate the Hebrew here, you can see how the language is not easy language here. It's very poetic language, and there's a lot of license involved in how these sentences are structured and created. So we've got a lot of Rashi on this because of this, right? So v'chemat bakar v'chalev tzon, right? Ze haya bimei Shlomo. This actually took place during the days of King Solomon. Shenemar, as it states in Kings 1, chapter 4, it says, Asara Bakar Briim. So what is left out of this verse that he's not saying is that Solomon's provisions for the day were 10 fat cattle, right? The Esrim Bakar, I think, or Re'i, right? And 20 calves or 20 cattle that were pastured, umeatzon, and 100 sheep. This was the amount of food in Solomon's palace that they consumed each day. Okay, but he's describing again this, how this prediction, this poem comes into the truth. Ve'im chalev karim. Right, let's see, make sure I've got it. No, this is chalev karim, forgive me. Ve'im chalev karim, which means, again, the best of the choicest of lambs. Zehaya bimei aseret hashvatim. This actually took place during the days of the 10 tribes. So in other words, the kingdom of Israel, we're talking about the northern kingdom, Shne'emar, as it states in here from Amos, it says, Ve'ochlim karim mitzon, and they consume lambs from the flock. And again, let's make sure I've got the right word. Chelev kiliot chita, right? I was saying, right? The cream of the kernels of wheat, but a kilia is a kidney, right? So it's like the shape of that little that kernel there. Zehaya bimei aseret hashvatim. Again, this. Am I doing this correctly with my slipping? Sorry, here, sorry. Zehaya bimei Shlomo. Again, this happened during the days of King Solomon. Shinemar, as it states in the first book of Kings, chapter 4, it's the same reference area. Vahi lechem Shlomo v'gomer, and it says, there's a verse that starts off that would say, the food, lechem, can mean bread, but it also means, here maybe it does mean the bread that they ate, because it goes on apparently to say 30 measures of fine flour. The dam anav tishteh chemar, right? Chamer, tishteh chamer, pausal form, right? And the blood of grapes, right? The juice of grapes. Bimei aseret hashvatim. So again, we're back into that period of the northern kingdom. This would be after King Solomon. And again, we are quoting from Amos chapter 6. Hashotim b'mizrikei yayin. Sorry, I left out a letter there. And they drink out of bowls of wine, right? They drink from bowls, not just glasses, but they're just saturated with all this. Chemat bakar, right? So we're saying the butter, right? He says hushomen. This is the fat, right, or the cream, haniklat me'agav hachalav, that is collected from on top of the milk. Right, that's what you make butter out of, from cream. V'chelev tzon. So here we go, a difference that he's pointing out. Chelev shel tzon, right? Keshehu davuk nakud chalev. Make sure I've got this correct. Sorry, I said chelev and I meant chalev tzon. Right, and that's because the word is chalav. Chalav is milk, and chalev is the possessive case here. Okay, let's get this. Sorry about that. Right, so he says keshehu davuk when it's in the possessive case. Right, it is pointed as chalev. But the chataf patach, that's what this stands for. A chataf patach is this vowel over here. Let me show you more clearly up here. Do you see this vowel, these two dots and this patach? That's called a chataf patach. That's the name of that vowel, right? Normally it's chalav, that would be the regular form of the noun, but chalev means milk of. Kamo yes, bechalav, bechalev imor. So he's quoting the famous verse about you shall not seethe a kid in its mother's milk, and mother's milk is chalev imor. It's mother's milk. karim. So this word karim, it's a little more of an unusual word, but it stands for kvasim, which would be lambs. Okay, for elim, kamashma'o, he says the elim meaning rams. It's simply, that's what it means. It means rams. B'nai Bashan, of Bashan. He says shmeinim hayu. They were fatly. Okay, these particular rams. Klayot chita, right, or kilyot chita, kilyot chita, right there. The kidneys, right, of the wheat. Chitim shmeinim ke, let's make sure this, okay. So this means they were fat, wheat, I think he could be saying here, chelev klayot, something like fat, or the fat of kidneys, the gasin kechulia, and they were as thick as kidneys. So thinking of the shape, right, of the grains of wheat, or the kernels of the wheat, and that they were large, and also they had plenty of the fat element from which we make the cream of wheat, right? And that's I believe a characteristic of wheat that the other grains don't have. The dam anav, he says, the blood of grapes. Hayashote anav, he would drink from a grape, right? He'd chew into a grape, and all this juice would burst out of it. The to'em yain chashuv, and it would taste as like superior wine. Okay, so I want to make sure I've got the. Okay, so chamer, right? So he says chamer yayin b'lashon Arami. He says chamer is simply wine in Aramaic. Chamer, right? So he says chamer, ein ze shem davar. This is not a noun. We shouldn't understand. So in other words, we shouldn't understand that he's drinking wine, but ela lashon meshubach. But it is a description of a praise, that somehow, when it says tishteh chamer, that what he's drinking is something superior. Betam, mishubach betam, that wonderful in flavor. So here's Venus belaz, and in Yiddish Weinicht. In other words, it's like wine, So sometimes we think of wine, I'm thinking of the phrase like kisses like wine, that there's something so delightful about it. And that's what he's saying, that when it says tishteh chamer, when he drinks the juice from the grapes, it's like, it's just so delightful, is what it's trying to say. And then he goes into a different thing, just to finish this off, and he says, "Ve'od yesh lefaresh." Let me make sure I've got the right phrase here. Shnei mikraot halalu. It's also possible to translate, or to interpret these two verses, these last two verses. So this verse and the verse above here, right, which is talking about the prosperity and describing the prosperity in various different ways. He's saying you can interpret them achar tirgum, the way that Targum translates them and interprets them. So here we go. Shel Onkelos of Onkelos. Ashri nun al tokfe ares. So this is that original verse, which is, he made them dwell on the heights of the land, etc. So if you look at that, if you look at the Onkelos, I can tell you that he describes it more as the victory and the ability that they had to overpower the Canaanites, and that God gave them that ability, and understands these various descriptions of prosperity in that way, rather than in a pshat way, which is, of course, the straightforward translation. He understands it as metaphoric. And we'll stop here. And this is, of course, what happens subsequently. And, might I say, tragically. So we'll catch this, God willing, tomorrow. And I'm going to stop the share here. Okay. So I don't know that there's a lot to comment while we're still on the recording, but if anybody wants to, for the record, I'm happy to record it. Otherwise, I will stop the recording.
I just want to mention that my Chabad version says it's from Kings chapter 4. Each time yours says chapter 5, mine says chapter 4 and lists verses, and I just think that's kind of an interesting thing.
It is. Now, I don't know whether it's simply a
Mine says 5, yours says 4. Excuse me.
yes. So whether okay, so it could be a misprint on my part, where that because if you look at a dalid, which would be 4, and a hey, which means 5, it could be missing that tiny little vertical line of the hey, you
I
know.
think that
So,
I
yeah.
don't know. I think there's some discrepancy. Mine says specifically chapter 5 verses 2 and 3.
Yes, I would tend to believe that. But the point is that, as you know, my version, the printing sometimes is not clear, right? There've been plenty of times where a yud looks like a vav looks like a yud, because they're both vertical lines. And remember, this was originally printed on a printing press, and so if it wasn't properly inked or it wasn't properly pressured against the typeface, it wouldn't come out really well. So I'm gonna stop the recording here. But thanks, Lauren. I didn't check the references.